Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
Today we're continuing part 2 of the Rod Ferrell trial. Rod Ferrell, a 16-year-old who claimed he was a vampire and who prided himself on his ability to control other disenfranchised young people, was on trial for a violent double homicide. He was accused of ambushing a couple in the safety of their quiet, rural Florida home and beating them to death in 1996. Their home was left a bloody, terrible crime scene. Rod went on the run and was arrested a few days later in Louisiana. With him was the couple's youngest daughter, 15-year-old Heather Wendorf, who told authorities she didn't know Rod was going to kill her family. Heather was never charged with a crime and was cleared by a grand jury, although her story got plenty of scrutiny. Rod was charged with first-degree murder. Today's episode begins as Rod Ferrell, the so-called vampire cult killer, makes a surprising revelation just as opening statements were underway for his 1998 trial. Here's Frank Stanfield, author of Cold-Blooded, a true crime story of a murderous teenage vampire cult. He also covered the trial for the Orlando Sentinel newspaper.
What happened was the prosecutor was just beginning his opening argument. And then the defense attorney interrupted and says, Rod we may make a change here, is what he said. So the judge cleared the courtroom, and we're all standing out in the hallway. Of course, everybody's immediately surrounding the prosecutor going, what's going on? Did you offer a deal or what? He says, no, I didn't offer a deal, and I don't want to offer a deal.
At the last minute, Rod had interrupted opening statements to plead guilty.
And what he did was he pleaded guilty in the guilt phase. You know, in Florida, of course, they have a 2-part murder trial if you're going for the death penalty. First part is the guilt phase. So he pleaded guilty to the crime, hoping that the state would drop the death penalty. Just give him life in prison. But Brad says, no, I'm going to go the whole deal here. I've got an obligation to the state to lay this whole thing out. So they went ahead with the second part.
And so in today's episode, we'll cover the penalty phase of the trial, in which the prosecution will argue for the death penalty, while Rod's defense team will try to save his life. Through the proceedings and the testimony, we'll learn more about Rod's childhood and what may have led to the heinous murders he had admitted to committing. We'll learn whether anything will sway a jury one way or another. We'll also learn what happened with the other defendants and where things stand with everyone, including Heather, today. This is Jillian in partnership with Law and Crime. You are listening to Court Junkie, episode 245, part 2. For the penalty portion of Rod's trial, the prosecution and the defense presented opening and closing arguments and called witnesses and experts to testify. Several young people who knew Rod in Florida or Kentucky were called to the stand. Some dressed in a similar fashion as Rod, a uniform of combat boots, a trench coat, and all black. Some of them testified about playing a role-playing vampire game with him, while others remembered him before he underwent his dramatic physical transformation in high school, before he claimed to be a vampire. Heather was not called as a witness. Although Rod had pleaded guilty, he still maintained that the murders were not premeditated. But there were witnesses who testified during the penalty phase that cast doubt on that. Audrey Marie Presson had been friends with Rod from their time together at Florida's Eustis High. They were in the same life management class freshman year. Back then, he wasn't calling himself a vampire or drinking anyone's blood. He was just a regular kid, Audrey testified. Grubby jeans, a regular tee. His natural red hair grew long. Kind of dorky, a normal freshman. He wasn't scary, just easygoing and laid back. Her friend changed after he moved to Kentucky, she said. He reminded her of Marilyn Manson. He had gotten really pale. His red hair was now dyed jet black. He wore eye makeup, she testified. He had dark glasses on. He had on a black t-shirt, black jeans, black coat, black cane, black fingernail polish, funny rings, cuts on his arms. He looked very transformed. But Audrey said she still felt that he was her friend, even with the makeover, and they stayed in touch, regularly talking on the phone. We were both at that time becoming interested in that sort of realm of things in vampirism, and he was telling me how he had started his own clan, and how he was sired, and now he's a vampire, and just things like that, she testified. I talked on the phone a lot with him that time because I had come down with mononucleosis and severe anemia because I was trying to cross over. I thought it would help me and things like that. We discussed witchcraft and certain spells and books. When Rod came back into town just before Thanksgiving 1996, he paid Audrey a visit at her house. It was the night before Heather's parents were murdered. Sunday, about 9 o'clock, when Rod showed up unannounced. Rod introduced Audrey to his 3 friends, Scott, Charity, and Dana, from Kentucky. They only stayed for about 30 minutes. Rod asked Audrey if she wanted to leave Eustis with him, but Audrey didn't go with them. Rod also foreshadowed that something was going to happen. "We're going to have some fun tomorrow night," he told her. Audrey assumed that meant the Kentucky group was going to party. Rod said he was there in Eustis for unfinished business. My understanding that unfinished business means that somebody has done somebody else wrong, and they will pay for it. That's unfinished business, Audrey testified. She didn't ask questions to get Rod to elaborate about their plans. She just let it be. Under questioning, Audrey testified that she no longer practiced witchcraft. She stopped after Heather's parents were killed. "It's a part of my life I don't want anything to do with. It's scary, not warm. It's not something you want to get caught up in," she said. 17-year-old Shannon Yo had been best friends with Rod at Eustis. He wasn't the vampire-crazed teenager back then. He got Shannon interested in poetry, and she had fun in his company. But the 2 close friends lost touch after Rod moved back to Kentucky in the 10th grade. Now that Rod was unexpectedly back in Florida in November 1996, he reached out to Shannon too. He called her up on the phone from Kmart and then stopped by her house twice to visit. On the night Heather's parents were murdered, Rod and his 3 Kentucky friends arrived at Shannon's house at about 5:30 p.m. Rod said something was wrong with their car and he needed to make a phone call. Shannon gave dinner to one of Rod's friends, and another got on her computer to play games. Shannon said she understood snippets of their plans. Rod was going to pick up Heather and Janine, Heather's best friend. He needed a map to Heather's house. Then they were going on a road trip to New Orleans. In Shannon's kitchen, Rod revealed more. "When we were sitting there and Rod started saying that he was going to go steal the Wendorf's car, and because his car wasn't working right, like I said before, and he said that he wanted to go kill her parents. And I asked him why, and he said because he wanted their car," she testified. "And he was swinging on that little corner beside the dishwasher and the sink, like he had his arms up like this and was swinging his legs back and forth. And he said that he wished the Wendorfs had that in their kitchen so he could use that to break their necks. And he said that his favorite way to kill somebody is decapitation. And then Rod, he took my kitchen knife and he cut his arm. and Dana went and drank some of his blood. And she said that she liked the blood better out of the neck. And then I took the knife away from him, and he tried to take the rest of my kitchen knives, and I told him no, and I took them. She said they wanted to smoke, and so she told them to go outside because she didn't want them doing that inside. They went on her porch and were talking. She said when she walked out, they stopped. At around 7:30 p.m., Rod said it was time to leave, and they left. Shannon didn't call the police. She said she thought Rod was just running his mouth again, telling another tale. She didn't believe that he was really going to kill the Wendorfs. Frank's reporting, along with court records, painted a frightening portrait of Rod Ferrell, a pathological liar, arrogant, smart and charismatic, manipulative, belittling his Kentucky friends and threatening them with graphic violence. Rod was someone who seemed to get a thrill out of hurting others. 6 weeks before the Wendorf murders, Rod was suspected of breaking into an animal shelter in Kentucky and torturing and killing animals. For the Orlando Sentinel, Frank wrote about it. Warning, the following is pretty graphic. More than 40 dogs were beaten at a Murray animal shelter, he wrote. 2 dogs were killed, including one dog whose legs were torn off. Grass was trampled down in a circular path around the 2 dead puppies in some kind of ritual, authorities said. Rod denied being involved. They blamed me for it because they thought I was a cult leader, he told Lake County Sheriff's investigators.
He denied it, but I think he did it. And here's the thing. If you look at the literature, like in psychology, that's what serial killers do. That's one of the first things that they do is they torture animals. They're cruel to animals. So I think Rod wanted to just keep on killing. He got a thrill out of it. In fact, he told the police on Mr. Wendorf, he said, I just kept on beating him and beating him and beating him and taking pleasure in that. I mean, that kind of thing. Just like it's a big thrill.
A child psychiatrist who evaluated Rod described him as a loner and an outcast for a good part of his life. He didn't fit in. He was viewed as odd by others, the doctor testified in court. He was teased. He got into drug abuse in his early teens, including the use of alcohol, marijuana, LSD, and other drugs. He didn't get involved in any sort of positive social activities. He didn't do any after-school activities, playing sports or anything like that. He was more on his own as an outcast.
Every kid wants attention, right? So there's 2 ways to get attention. One is you can be the star athlete or the first chair in the symphony or whatever. The other one is to be so obnoxious, such an outlaw, such an outrageous character. He dressed in a long black trench coat and carried a stick and wore an inverted cross, which is a sign of demon worship or devil worship and that kind of thing. So that's his way of getting attention. And he got it. He got the attention he wanted.
Rod drew in a handful of other teenagers like him, who came from bad homes and had tough upbringings.
His followers, these other kids from Kentucky, they were from dysfunctional families, broken families, poor. One kid was so poor, it was unbelievable. They were put in foster care, they were abused, all this kind of stuff. So you can see where they were looking for some kind of meaning in their life.
But Heather Wendorf didn't fit into that category. She came from a home, both parents still together, where her father encouraged her talents and her mother volunteered at her school. Why would Heather want to follow Rod? Frank gave his theory.
He was an artist type. He was very talented and very smart. But, and so Heather was very, very smart, and she was a very good artist. So this artistic thing, this fantasy that she had, that was all part of the artistic creativity out there stuff going on.
They were both interested in the macabre and dark images. Heather liked to draw pictures of gargoyles. In court, a child psychiatrist testified that Rod drew pictures of demons, of skulls, of blood, of eyes free-floating in the middle of the page with tears coming down, of weapons, of knives, of clubs, and of warriors in very elaborate battle gear. To try and understand 16-year-old Rod Farrell, you had to look backward. That was going to be part of the defense's strategy to save Rod from the death penalty after he pleaded guilty to murdering Heather's parents. During the penalty phase, the defense called witnesses who could testify about how unstable and troubled his childhood had been. Perhaps no one could testify to that better than Rod's own mother. 35-year-old Sandra Gibson, who also went by the name Star, testified that she was 17 when she gave birth to Rod. When he was born, he had the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, and he was blue, and they had to work with him to get him to breathe, Sandra testified. She married Rod's father, Rick Farrell, but they broke up 9 days later after living together, and they soon divorced. Rod grew up hardly seeing his dad. She testified that his dad didn't send Christmas presents or cards. Rick Farrell, also 35, testified that he hadn't abandoned his son, although he only remembered a few times seeing him growing up. Rick said Sandra refused to let him see Rod. Rick's testimony was quick on the stand, but it left an impression on Frank.
He gets in there to testify and says he couldn't see Rod as a kid because Sandra made it so difficult. And he never even looked at Rod. He didn't even look at him. So it's like you're going, man, I kind of feel sorry for the kid. You know what I mean? Even though he's obviously done this terrible thing. I mean, that's cold. And then Sandra gets on there, and she's an interesting person, to say the least.
Sandra testified that she had once worked as a sex worker and had a history of using drugs. Sometimes she and Rod moved in with Sandra's parents. Sometimes Sandra was gone for weekends at a time to see her boyfriend. Child psychiatrist Dr. Wade Myers testified about this in court. She pretty much tried to raise Rod on her own, didn't want her grandparents, who were also in the home, to interfere with the raising of Rod, so she tried to do it on her own. But at the same time, she was busy with a lot of boyfriends, had a history of drug abuse, and really wasn't there to do much in the way of discipline or guidance for Rod as he was growing up, he said. Rod told one clinical psychiatrist that his mother, quote, loses her grip on reality. He said she tends to become very volatile, have mood swings, and generally is not a stable person. He said when she would start yelling at him that he would simply go into his room and, quote, crank up the music. Rod complained that his grandparents, who had helped raise him, were diehard Christians. By the time he was 15, he had moved more than half a dozen times. As he got older, Rod stayed up all night playing Dungeons and Dragons. One high school friend was alarmed by how seriously Rod took the game. He seemed to think that the fantasy world was real life. The few people in his life that Rod let in seemed to be involved in the occult. Sandra had been married at one point to someone described as a Satanist. And when they lived in Murray, Kentucky, Rod became friends with Jaden Murphy, who practiced vampirism. Jaden testified that didn't mean he could fly or be turned into dust when the sun came up, or be repelled by garlic, or be immortal. A modern vampire, he said, had a hunger for blood. Jaden was the one who crossed over Rod and turned him into a vampire, he said. Jaden also said vampires followed a certain code. They could not kill. They could only drink someone's blood with permission. Whether as a human or a vampire, Rod lived his life without boundaries or rules. He wanted to stay out all night and play one of his favorite games, Vampire Masquerade, a live-action role-playing game where people used dice and dressed as their characters. Rod smoked cigarettes. His clothes were all black, just like his room, decorated in all black, which had an altar with the Book of the Undead placed on it. Rod grew his hair long. He wore chains and put on makeup. Rod admitted to the psychiatrist that he had an F-it attitude since he was 9. It was a cross between pain and rage in his head, he said. Dr. Myers testified, just within the 2 years before Rod's arrest, Rod's mother noticed, and the grandparents also confirmed this, that Rod seemed to have personality changes. His appearance changed. He seemed depressed. He seemed apathetic. He wasn't doing well at school. He started getting involved in the occult. For instance, she found him one time at their house cutting himself with this other girl, and they were apparently drinking each other's blood. So she noticed more of a disturbance in his personality. Rod stopped doing his work at school. They were deliberately giving him classes that he didn't like, and he said, forget it. He goes, I'm not even going to do the work, Rod's mother testified. Rod's attorney asked, so you just let him not do the work? Sandra's response, yes, actually, I did. The attorney asked, and you approved of him smoking? Sandra said, I let him smoke in the house, but he wasn't supposed to smoke at school. One of Sandra's boyfriends, a handyman with a criminal record who lived in their apartment complex, gave Rod a tattoo on his arm. Rod didn't need to hide it from his mom. Sandra testified she was across from him at the table when he got it. Rod's life was spiraling even more out of control as he got expelled from school and was using heroin and LSD. He saw a counselor. Sandra let him stay out all night and sleep all day. She took him to a, quote, freak hangout called the Nightmare Club when they went on vacation to Florida. When they went back to Kentucky, Rod rang up a $1,000 phone bill talking to Heather and Janine back in Eustis. During one of those calls, Sandra said she thought she heard Heather tell Rod that she wanted her parents dead. How would you know that? Rod's attorney asked Sandra, since Sandra could only hear Rod's end of the conversation. She answered, I heard him responding to what Heather was saying, and he goes, chill out. He goes, like, I'll be down there, or I can come down and pick you up, stuff like that. And I told him, I go, what are you talking about? And I said, tell her, don't be doing anything crazy. I said, if she wants to come up here and live with us for a while, she can. Okay, so how do you know that it was anything about hurting her parents? The attorney asked again. Sandra said, because he specifically, that was the word that he was saying. He was like repeating what she was saying and stuff and talking about, he said that, he goes, I won't do it, but there's a guy over in Orlando. You can go over there and hire somebody for $500 to do it. Sandra testified that she herself believed in vampires. In rural Kentucky, she stood out by dressing in all black and painting her nails to match. She started becoming close to the group of vampire-obsessed teenagers her son hung out with. She flirted with the boys, according to court testimony. Sandra later got into trouble for writing a letter to solicit sex from one of the teen's 14-year-old brother. She was sentenced to 3 years probation after she was charged with criminal intent to commit unlawful transactions with a minor. Sandra also talked about being stalked by a demon.
And she told the psychologist one time that she thought she was being stalked by a demon hanging around her window. She lived on the second floor of an apartment building. So, all this was just like enough to make your head spin.
Frank recalled one bizarre moment during a break in the trial when Sandra made an off-the-cuff statement to him.
Sandra, his mother, walked past, and I just had an interview with her right before the trial. And she said, "Oh, that vampirism is just silliness. That was silly. It's dumb." She walks past us to go to the restroom, turns and looks at us and says, "We live forever." And the other reporters looked at me and says, "What did she say?"
Court. The defense asked the jury to spare Rod Ferrell from the death penalty and to give him life in prison instead. Here's what the defense attorney said during the opening statements of the penalty phase.
Because we're going to ask you in this point to give Rod life, because that's what he wants. You're going to have a lot of witnesses coming to you. Rod was born stillborn with the umbilical cord around his neck. He suffered a severe case of encephalitis as a young man, as a young boy. He wasn't even expected to live. He even suffered some head traumas before the incident on November the 25th, 1996. One thing that we talked to you about is his drug use. In his early teens, he used quite a bit of drugs. He doesn't deny that. We talked with you about that on opening statement, on Boyd Iron. He dealt with acid, Prozac, and marijuana. He also drank alcohol on a regular basis. And you're going to hear how the drugs and the alcohol and the other things in his life came to effect on November the 25th of 1996. The doctors are going to testify about a personality disorder Rod has called schizotypal personality disorder. These traits sometimes overlap with schizophrenia, which goes almost to the psychosis. Dr. Myers is going to give you the definition of that. He's going to explain to you how he came to that conclusion, the factors he used, the evidence that's supplied to him to get to that conclusion. You'll hear that these mental illnesses and other problems that Rod has suffered were a contributing factor to the night of November the 25th, 1996.
The defense called Dr. Wade Myers, a child psychiatrist who had done research studies on youth who committed murder and other violent crimes. Dr. Myers met with now 17-year-old Rod to interview him, test him, and evaluate him 3 separate times. At their meetings, Dr. Myers noticed cuts running up and down both of Rod's arms, some of the marks fresh, others healed. He testified that Rod was smart, above average intelligence for his age. He had a good vocabulary, although he suspected Rod might have had a learning disability in math, which he said was a sign that his brain hadn't properly developed. What concerned Dr. Myers was Rod's disturbed thinking, where he got lost in fantasy and metaphors. He said he believed Rod had a pretty serious personality disturbance. When he was a young boy, Rod claimed he heard voices of angels and devils in his head. The voices stayed with him as a teenager and confronted him and gave him guidance. Sometimes Rod smelled sulfur, a sign that a demon was lurking around. His delusions sometimes brought physical sensations, like once when Rod thought he felt a knife going through his chest, even though it wasn't real. He said that sometimes that he had these special powers, and when he would be about to go into a room, a cold wind would precede him, and the people in the room would then feel this cold wind before he got there, that he was radiating off due to his powers, Dr. Myers testified. As we were talking, if I asked him a question, he was pretty well able to answer the question in a reasonable way. But if I let him start talking on his own, he would go off into kind of a bizarre fantasy thinking. It was like it would take on a life of its own in the way that he would go with the conversation, he said. He showed a disturbance in his facial expressions. For instance, he would laugh at serious things when he had taken some real chances with his risk-taking. He would run out in front of a semi coming down the street, and he was telling me about this. It was as though he was challenging fate, and he would get sort of a high doing this, and he was laughing about it as he was telling me about this in the jail. He said another thing that showed a disturbed personality was that Rod would sometimes laugh when he would talk about violent acts that to a normal person would cause them to feel serious and somber. In researching Rod's family tree, Dr. Myers said he learned that Rod's grandfathers on both his mother's and father's sides had a history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. He said Rod's mother had been diagnosed with a psychotic disorder and was delusional, believing in witchcraft, special powers, and magic. He said Rod's mother had also told him that he had been abused as a child. One of the first things she told me was that she had found, when Rod was a baby, just several months old, she found him to be bruised up, and his biological father admitted in so many words to her that he had beaten Rod, he said. So I learned that Rod had been physically abused as an infant. He said Rod also admitted to using LSD 40 or more times since he was 13 or 14. The defense attorney asked what he believed Rod's diagnosis was. The primary one, Dr. Myers said, was schizotypal personality disorder. For the jury, he explained what that was, calling it sort of a minor version of schizophrenia. The schizotypal personality disorder is a personality disorder that is marked by somebody who has a lot of odd mannerisms. They have eccentric behaviors. They have an unusual appearance. Possibly they have strange, bizarre thoughts, he said. They often are lost in excessive, strange fantasy life. They tend to not fit in mainstream society very well. They don't relate to other people very well. They have trouble with close relationships. And this is a disorder to have some overlap with schizophrenia in that these people, they may hear voices. They may have false, fixed beliefs like they are being executed. He said possible treatment includes counseling, both individual or group therapy, and antipsychotic medication. Rod's attorney asked, "And, doctor, can you say within a reasonable degree of certainty whether Mr. Farrell was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance on November 25th, 1996? Yes, it's my opinion that he was, Dr. Myers said. Under cross, the prosecutor asked him, in spite of your conclusions about Mr. Farrell's mental health status, he knew right from wrong when he went in that house, didn't he? Dr. Myers said, I believe he did. He had the ability to say no when given the choice of killing them or not killing them, didn't he? The prosecutor asked. I think his ability was impaired for a number of reasons, including mental illness, Dr. Myers responded. But he could have said no, couldn't he? The prosecutor argued. Was he not thinking when he walked into the Wendorf's house and beat them in the head 20 times until they were dead? He was thinking, wasn't he? The defense also called Dr. Harry Kropp, a clinical psychologist, who agreed that Rod knew right from wrong and wasn't legally insane when he killed Heather's parents. However, Dr. Kropp called Rod seriously disturbed and said Rod came from one of the most dysfunctional families he had ever seen in his career of evaluating 700 people charged with first-degree murder. Dr. Kropp called Rod's vampirism the ultimate rebellion. I don't believe that Rod is a vampire, and I don't believe that Rod believes that he's a vampire. But this is a part of his whole personality structure that he has taken, both to view himself as being different and to be accepted, and also to try and negate to some degree the rejection that he has felt in his life, Dr. Kropp testified. When listening to the testimony for his Orlando Sentinel coverage, Frank had wondered how the defense's expert witnesses might sway the jury.
You also had all this defense expert testimony from psychologists, which can work two different ways. They were trying to say, look, the kid had no chance. He had a terrible childhood. He has all these personality disorders and all that. But at the same time, when you're saying that, the jury's looking at him like, yeah, he's messed up. He needs to be locked up forever at the very least, or maybe we should just kill this guy because this is just so terrible. So it's a double-edged sword.
Dr. Laura Hare, the associate medical examiner for District 5, which included Lake County, conducted the autopsies of Richard and Ruth on November 27, 1996. Dr. Hare counted 22 wounds on Richard's head. Ruth had 21 wounds on her head and face. She also had defensive wounds on both of her arms, as though she had been trying to protect herself from the attack. Richard didn't have any. The couple's deaths had been violent from being struck blow by blow from a crowbar, the murder weapon. The defense objected to the autopsy photos being shown, saying they inflamed the jury, creating undue prejudice in their minds. The judge allowed the photographs to be shown, but warned the jury and everyone in the courtroom that they were going to be difficult to look at. According to Frank, the state's case was strong against Rod. Ruth Queen had valiantly fought for her life, which gave prosecutors direct physical evidence to tie Rod to her murder.
This is the interesting thing, too, because beneath her fingernails, Ruth Queen's fingernails, was some blood because she scratched Rod's face. So it was like she was pointing her bloody fingernail from the grave at Rod because it was his DNA under her fingernails. So there was DNA, there was a confession, they just had it all.
The intense media coverage that followed Rod's trial was full of dark, sensational themes, like occult rituals, vampires, cults, and deadly teenagers. Even the adults in this story, like Rod's mother, were full of shock value. But at the heart of the case were two innocent people who were brutally murdered, ambushed one evening in their own home. Before the state rested its case against Rod, family members read victim impact statements to tell more about the lives of Ruth and Richard. Ruth's oldest daughter, Paula, who lived in Dallas with her husband and kids, took the stand first. Paula had a different father than Jennifer and Heather. She spoke briefly, but her point was clear. Ruth had been a loving mother and grandmother. Ruth had been a mother of 4 children, all girls. She sounded like an idyllic parent, someone who loved crafts and making quilts and volunteering at the high school. She was generous, the kind of person who gave away what she made. Robert Wendorf, Richard's younger brother, took the stand next. Robert, who lived outside of Orlando, described his brother as someone who was hardworking, never missing a day of work and always picking up overtime shifts. He was just an employer's dream, Robert testified. Richard was thrifty, wearing old shoes to save money. And all of those traits paid off as Richard made his dreams come true. Richard and Ruth moved outside of Orlando and bought a big piece of land in the country to build the house they had fantasized about. It wasn't going to be easy, though. The land was almost inhabitable because of the thick brush and trees. But Richard cleared the land himself, and Ruth made picnic lunches and brought the girls to help pick up sticks. Richard shared his vision with his family, explaining where their future driveway would be and where their garage would be built. His dream became a reality. Their house was constructed. Just like Ruth, Richard was a devoted parent. He bought a piano for Heather and Jennifer to practice on, and they both became talented musicians who knew how to compose music. He bought Jennifer a brand new car when she turned 16. And when Jennifer let someone else drive it and the car was totaled, he bought her another one. He was forgiving. Richard was only 49 when he was murdered in the home he had worked so hard to create for his family. Ruth was 54. After both sides had called their last witnesses, the prosecution and the defense gave closing arguments. State Attorney Brad King went first for the prosecution. Now, I know it seems we've tried so many people in this case. We've tried Heather Wendorf. We've tried Sandra Gibson, he told the jury. But there is only one person who is really on trial here. Only one name in the indictment that you will hear that is of any significance for you. That is the name Roderick Farrell. Rod, the prosecutor said, was the leader, the undisputed leader of this group of 4 who came to Florida. He came in part to get his little women that followed after him. That was a reference to Janine and Heather. Prosecutor King stressed the brutality of Rod's crimes. For Richard Wendorf, sitting on the couch, quote, "You heard Rod talking about swinging the crowbar up and stopping, swinging it up and stopping. And then finally he decides he might as well do it, and he swings it full force into his head, and then begins to beat him and beat him and beat him because he doesn't want him to be alive. He beat on Richard Wendorf until he could finally get him to stop breathing. And when he didn't stop breathing after beatings on the head, took the crowbar up and he tried to stab him in the heart. For Rod's second victim, Ruth, he said, quote, "She is fighting for her very life, but she is no match for a young man with a steel crowbar. And he beats her down, and he beats her, and he beats her until he nearly accomplishes what he told Shannon Yo his favorite method of killing was: decapitation." King described the murders as cold, calculated, and premeditated. Rod could have spared Ruth's life to leave Heather and Jennifer with one parent alive, but he was cruel and unsparing. "Ladies and gentlemen," King said, "the time for mercy has passed, not because of the youth, but because of his choices and his decisions and his responsibility. The time for mercy, ladies and gentlemen, is no more." He said that by his actions, Rod had forfeited his right to live here on Earth. Next, it was Rod's defense attorney, Candace Hawthorne's turn. Rod Farrell took responsibility for this crime. He stood up and he said, "I'm guilty," she said. "He lives in a 6-by-9-foot cell. He can't escape it. It's there in his face every day." And finally, ladies and gentlemen, Roderick J. Farrell will be removed from society for the rest of his life. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will not be a part of our society. He will be segregated from the rest of society for the rest of his life. Please make the right decision and recommend to the court that Roderick Farrell be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole 2 times. In making her case why life in prison was the fair punishment, she brought up Heather Wendorf, who again never testified at Rod's trial and had not been charged with the crime herself. "Now, Prosecutor King wants you to ignore certain issues in this case," she said. "He wants you to forget that a very significant part of this case is Heather Wendorf, the daughter of Ruth Queen and Richard Wendorf. Ladies and gentlemen, we can't ignore that. She may not have been in that house, but I submit to you she was fully conscious and knew what the possibilities were." She argued that Heather never tried to run away or to get help when she went on the road trip with her parents' killer to Louisiana. She also pointed to Rod's upbringing and childhood. But to think that a young man was so hurt and in pain from the reality of his life that he should seek out the fantasy world as bizarre as the one he did should suggest how bad this kid's life really was, she said. Choices? He didn't have the tools to make the right choices. Decisions? He didn't have the emotional structure to understand how to make those decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, rage doesn't occur because you want to rob someone and take their car. Rage occurs from years and years of pent-up frustration and anger and abuse, neglect, and abandonment. Feeding into this young man's mind, all of the occult, the vampirism, the Dungeons and Dragons, the demonic, there is only so much a young man can handle, and this young mind was narrowing to begin with. The jury began deliberating. When they were done, the judge read the verdict. The jury had unanimously ruled that Rod should be put to death. But that's not the end of the story.
And then at the end of the trial, he's convicted of first-degree murder, and the jury votes unanimously, 12-0, to send him to death row, to send him to be executed. But the Florida Supreme Court commutes the sentence to life because he was too young. But here's the thing. He comes back a few years ago, and I cover his appeal because the Supreme Court keeps moving the ball. They said, well, if you're a juvenile when you commit murder, you don't automatically get the automatic mandatory sentence of life. You're entitled to a special hearing because your brain is not developed fully until you're 25 years old. So he comes back a few years ago for a rehearing. And Jennifer, the poor girl, discovers her home's turned into a bloodbath. She testifies. she begs the judge not to let him out, not to lessen his life sentence, because she's afraid if he gets out, he'll kill her and her family. So it's one of those cases that just keeps on, and who knows? He's appealed that. The appeals go on forever. There's nothing current on appeal, but still, you never know.
Currently, the now 43-year-old Rod Farrell hasn't won his freedom. So as of the writing of this podcast, he remains in prison, serving life at the Santa Rosa Correctional Institution outside Pensacola, Florida. He is no longer on death row. Howard Scott Anderson, who broke into the Wendorf house with Rod, was eventually resentenced from a life sentence to a 40-year term. He is scheduled to be released in 2030 when he is 51 years old, according to online Florida Department of Correction records. As far as the other two girls with them, Dana Cooper was released from prison in 2011, and Charity Kesey was released in 2006. Also in 2006, Heather Wendorf, who by then was 25 years old, married, and living in North Carolina, spoke to the Orlando Sentinel for the first time in years. She described to the paper how she felt alienated from the rest of her relatives, even though she had been cleared of any involvement in her parents' murders. Over the years, she finally reconnected with her grandma and other family. She has remained close with her sister, Jennifer. It's hard not to feel guilty when every news station in America is telling you you're guilty, she told the Sentinel. She insisted that she had loved her parents and that most of my childhood was just perfect. I'll always have that to build upon. And that's all for this episode. Thanks to Frank Stanfield for sharing his insight into this case. To learn more, check out Frank's book, Cold-Blooded, a true crime story of a murderous teenage vampire cult, which is available on Amazon and Wild Blue Press. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram at Court Junkie, by tweeting us at Court Junkie Pod, or by emailing us at podcast@courtjunkie.com. This episode was researched and written by Gabrielle Russon. If you'd like to hear these episodes without the ads, hear additional Court Junkie bonus episodes, or get access to our weekly newsletter regarding fascinating court cases, check out our Patreon options at courtjunkie.com/support. And be sure to check out our sister podcast, Civil, which covers interesting civil cases and trials. You can subscribe by searching for Civil Court Junkie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.